Welcome to the History of Public Transport, a series where we delve into some of the most popular modes of transportation that gets us through our day-to-day lives and take a look at how they came to be. This episode will be spanning from the wagon ways of ancient Greece to the steam-powered visions of George Stephenson. So sit back, relax, and wait for the refreshments trolley because this is the history of rail travel. If we're going to be looking at the full history of rail travel, we're going to have to go way back to the year 600 BC. The Diokos in Corinth, Greece is one of the earliest known rutways, which is a predecessor to the railways that we know of today. It's essentially a paved road with grooves worn into the path to guide the wheels of large wooden cars that would carry anything from goods to entire naval vessels. These early versions of the technique used slaves or animals to move the cars along the tracks. Many similar versions of this idea existed across ancient Greece, and others were found in Malta and other parts of the Roman Empire. These early rutways remained in use for around 600 years, and most of them fell into disuse after the empire collapsed. It wasn't until the Dark Ages that the state of rail was closer to what we know of today. The earliest known record of railways in Europe is from around 1350 on a stained glass window in the Minster of Freiburg in Germany, but the earliest surviving railway is a cliff railway to the Hohensalzburg castle in Salzburg, Austria. Although it is an updated version, it is still functioning to this day. By the mid-16th century, wooden rail tracks were common in mines all across Europe, and by the 1600s, horse-drawn wagonways were common in Britain. It wasn't until 1768 in Coalbrookdale, England, that iron was used in the development of railways. Iron plates were secured to wooden rails in order to reduce friction, which also allowed for different gauges to be used. Up until this point, all of the developments in the rail industry were for private use, mostly for transporting goods. But in 1806, the Swansea and Mumbles Railway was opened, which was the first horse-drawn passenger railway. By this point, steam engines had been around for just under a century, albeit for pumping water rather than for rail transport, and in 1812, Matthew Murray built Salamanca, which was to be the first commercially successful steam locomotive. Eventually, wooden rails were phased out and were replaced with rails made from wrought iron in 1820. But they were replaced with steel shortly after in 1857. Fast forward to 1825 and we find George Stephenson's famous locomotion, and 4 years later came the introduction of Stephenson's rocket. Stephenson entered rocket into a competition known as the Rainhill Trials, and as his locomotive was the only entry to meet the full contest requirements, he subsequently won the £500 prize and the contract to produce his steam engine design for the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. The line was opened in 1830 and was the first intercity route ever built. Just 20 years later, in the 1850s, Britain had laid a staggering 7,000 miles of track across the country. The construction of the first underground railway, the Metropolitan Railway in London, began in 1860 and was opened in 1863. This line is still running to this day, but you may better know it as the Metropolitan Line on the London Underground network. It was at this point in history that the rail industry started to take off in the United States. In 1830, the first working American locomotive, built by Peter Cooper, was used to cover 13 miles of track between Baltimore and Ohio, a stretch of track which later went on to become a full working line. A few similar sized lines were opened around this time, but it wasn't until the 1850s that long-distance rail travel became a practical reality. The American rail system grew massively between then and the 1890s, although the Civil War did slow down certain developments. By then, the first transcontinental railway had been built, spanning an enormous 1,912 miles from the existing rail networks in Iowa and Nebraska all the way to the Pacific coast of San Francisco. It wasn't long until electricity found its way into the railways, with the first fully electrified line being completed in northern Italy in 1902. The early 1900s saw the first introduction of diesel power and became commonplace after World War II, since the price of labour needed for the upkeep of steam locomotives increased massively and consequently made steam power travel financially impractical. During the war, internal combustion engine technology had dramatically advanced to a point where they were cheaper to run and even more powerful than steam locomotives, which caused many railway companies to switch to diesel. And as if the rail industry wasn't suffering enough already, the large-scale construction of motorways came shortly after the end of World War II, making rail an even more unpopular mode of transportation. Long-haul travel then became the main concern for railway companies, but even that was short-lived as affordable air travel was just around the corner and started to take even more customers away from the rail industry. With that and the infamous beaching cuts in the early 60s, the future was looking bleak for rail. You might be asking, well, how is the rail industry still around today? Well, the industry took a turn for the better in 1964 when, in Japan of all places, the Shinkansen high-speed rail trains were introduced between Tokyo and Osaka, which put rail at the forefront of intercity travel. And in the 1970s, the introduction of containerization became a huge player in revitalizing the rail industry, as it was the most practical way of the inland transportation of shipping containers, allowing the freight side of rail to become more competitive and able to become part of the intermodal freight transport system. Train manufacturing companies started to focus more on the accessibility of their trains in the 90s and introduced low-floor trains, and many old tramways were transformed into light railways, allowing more passengers to use them. And with that, we've just about arrived at the 21st century, where most of the trains have free Wi-Fi on board, yet people still complain about them being 2 minutes late. I've put a card in the top right corner of the screen with a poll asking which type of transport I should make a video about next. Until then, be sure to take all personal belongings with you, and please mind the gap between the train and the platform. Ta-ra!